Welcome. I'm Srikanth Reddy. I teach in the English department and in the program in creative writing here at the university, and I'm very pleased to have the honor of introducing Amitav Ghosh for tonight's Berlin Family Lecture. Midway through Sea of Poppies, the opening volume of Amitav Ghosh's recently completed Ibis trilogy, an antique precursor of our modern-day air conditioning unit, makes an unexpected appearance amid the merciless torpor of a 19th century Calcutta summer's day. Recently, Ghosh writes, Mr. Burnham had installed a new fixture to cool the dining room. Known as a thermantidote, the device was a winnowing machine that had been fitted with a propeller and a thick mat of fragrant couscous. The men who had once pulled the ropes of the overhead punkas, a manually operated native Indian fan, were now employed in operating the thermantidote. While one wetted the machine's rush screen, the other turned the propeller by means of a handle, forcing a constant stream of air through the dampened mat. Thus, by means of evaporation, the machine was supposed to create a wonderfully cooling breeze. Such, at least, was the theory. You can probably imagine how well this contraption functioned in practice. Product of the unholy union of a winnowing machine and a propeller, emblems of the industrial age's advances in the realms of agriculture and transport, the thermantidote's very name encodes Western society's dream of a technological antidote for the atmosphere that sustains us. This comical item of historical decor, which has mercifully passed into extinction, furnishes a little parable of climate control for our time. Though Mr. Burnham's glorified swamp cooler doesn't do a very good job of making his dining room more comfortable, the thermantidote added greatly to the humidity, making everyone sweat even more than usual, and it also produced a loud grinding noise that often drowned the conversation. It has unexpected consequences, like all human efforts to govern the environment. Inaudible to the elders, deafened by the machine's infernal racket, the young paramours Paulette and Zachary are able to carry on a furtive conversation that crucially advances the plot of the novel, thanks to this literary historical device. Ghosh has been thinking about how the weather informs, distorts, and evades our literary imaginary for some time now. At yesterday's lecture, he told the story of a tornado that improbably, yet unforgettably, crossed his path on the streets of New Delhi nearly 40 years ago. We heard how the eye of the storm passed over the young Ghosh, and how, decades later, this extraordinarily resourceful writer still finds himself unable to interpolate the incident into novelistic form. But I think he's already laid the groundwork for writing this story. Near the beginning of River of Smoke, the second installment of the Ibis trilogy, an illiterate woman named Diti paints a little vignette on the wall of a remote island grotto, memorializing her separation from her husband and friends during a storm at sea. I'll quote from the novel. There was at least one thing about Diti's depiction of the parting that was genuinely visionary. This was the fact that she had shown the storm to be wrapped around an eye. This bespoke an understanding of the nature of storms that was, for its time, not just unusual, but revolutionary. Because 1838, the year of that storm, was when a scientist first suggested that hurricanes might be composed of winds rotating around a still center. An eye, in other words. Diti's cave art anticipates scientific theories of storm formation in the Victorian era. Of course, Ghosh enjoys the luxury of authorial hindsight in endowing his literary character with the gift of prophecy. This is how the historical novel, and, in a sense, how history itself works. We don't ask novels to predict what the weather will be like tomorrow. We read fiction to imagine what a historical climate felt like to others before us. Passing through the eye of the storm, that still turning point where the freaky system looks back at you, Ghosh's characters encounter the uncanny, but they also feel something that verges on wonder. When the exiled former Zamindar, Neil, learns that storms too have eyes, he imagines the phenomenon this way. And again, I quote from the novel. A gigantic oculus at the far end of a great spinning telescope, examining everything it passed over, upending some things and leaving others unscathed. Looking for new possibilities, creating fresh beginnings, rewriting destinies, and throwing people together who would never have met. Looking for new possibilities, creating fresh beginnings, rewriting destinies, and throwing together people who would never meet. This meteorological event sounds a lot like a novelist, doesn't it? That day in Delhi, when the eye of the storm passed over an aspiring novelist who had yet to write his first book, a sequence of events, a historical narrative, was set into motion. In a kind of reverse butterfly effect, that vanished tornado brought Amitav Ghosh here to speak to us this evening. In his theses on the philosophy of history, Walter Benjamin memorably describes one kind of attitude toward the past. This is how one pictures the angel of history, writes Benjamin. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. The angel of history, not to be confused with his cousin, the angel of historical materialism in Benjamin's Celestial Order, faces the storm that blows him backward into the future. The angel of art, in Ghosh's meteorological imagination, suffers from a different predicament. He finds himself, for a brief spell, in the storm's traveling eye, on the inside, as it were, facing inward. An equally awkward position, but one that offers its own necessary illuminations. Every one of Ghosh's books is a literary dispatch from the eye of the storm. Few authors are so qualified to predict what will come next, if not in tomorrow's weather report, then for the novel as a cultural form in the coming years. Please join me in welcoming once more Amitav Ghosh.
Thank you very much indeed for that very, very insightful and interesting introduction. Doing lectures is a novel thing for me. When I was asked to do these lectures and when I knew that they were going to be published as a book, I really didn't know how I would set about it, because the lectures have to be short and books are long. And of course, academics lecture all the time, but I don't. The thing I do is I write books. So I just sat down and wrote a book. And, that's what I know to do. So in effect, I had to spend a lot of time cutting back this book to make it tractable. And this part is one of the bits where I've had to cut a lot. In the final part of my novel, The Hungry Tide, there is a scene in which a cyclone sends a gigantic storm surge into the Sundarbans. The wave results in the death of one of the principal characters, who gives his life protecting another. This scene was extraordinarily difficult to write. In preparation for it, I combed through a great deal of material on catastrophic waves, storm surges, as well as tsunamis. In the process, as often happens in writing fiction, the wave and the plight of my characters became frighteningly real to me. The Hungry Tide was published in the summer of 2004. A few months after the publication, on the night of December 25th, I was back in my family home in Kolkata. The next morning, on logging onto the net, I learned that a cataclysmic tsunami had been set off by a massive undersea earthquake in the Indian Ocean. The news had a deeply unsettling effect on me. Live footage of the tsunami merged with the images that had been implanted in my mind while writing The Hungry Tide in a way that was almost overwhelming. I became frantic. I could not focus on anything. A couple of days later, I obtained a commission from a newspaper and flew to Port Blair, the capital of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, many of which had been devastated by the tsunami. After a few days, I was able to board an Indian Air Force plane that was carrying supplies to one of the worst affected of the Nicobar Islands. Unlike the Andamans, which rise steeply from the sea, the Nicobars are low-lying islands. Being situated close to the quake's epicenter, they had been very badly hit. Many settlements had been razed. After disembarking at an Air Force base, I visited a shoreside town called Malacca. That fire is burning like 5 days after the tsunami. Gas cylinders caught fire. And Malacca had been reduced literally to its foundations. Of the houses, only the floors were left, and here and there, the stump of a wall. It was as though the place had been hit by a bomb that was designed specifically to destroy all things human. For one of the strangest aspects of the scene was that the coconut palms were largely unaffected. They stood serenely amidst the rubble, their fronds waving gently in the breeze that was blowing in from the sparkling, sun-drenched sea. I wrote in my notebook, the damage was limited to a half-mile radius along the shore. In the island's interior, everything is tranquil, peaceful, indeed astonishingly beautiful. One of the ironies of the situation is that the most upwardly mobile people on the island were living at its edges. Such was the pattern of settlement that the indigenous islanders lived mainly in the interior. They were largely unaffected. Those who had settled along the seashore were mainly middle-class people from the mainland. In settling where they had silently expressed their trust in the belief that highly improbable events belong not in the real world, but in fantasy. In other words, even here, in a place about as far removed as possible from the metropolitan centers that have shaped middle-class lifestyles, the distribution of the population had come to reflect the uniformitarian expectations that are rooted in the regularity of bourgeois life. At the Air Force base where my plane had landed, there was another even more dramatic illustration of this. The functional parts of the base, where the planes and machinery were kept, were located to the rear, well away from the water. The living areas, comprising of pretty little two-story houses, were built much closer to the sea, at the edge of a beautiful palm-fringed beach. As always in military matters, the protocols of rank were strictly observed. The higher the rank of the officers, the closer their houses were to the water, and the better the view that they and their families enjoyed. Such was the design of the base that the likelihood of survival was small, and inasmuch as it existed at all, it was in inverse relation to rank. The commander's house was thus the first to be hit. The sight of the houses was disturbing for reasons beyond the immediate tragedy of the tsunami and the many lives that had been lost there. The design of the base suggested a complacency that was in itself a kind of madness. Nor could the siting of these buildings be attributed to the usual improvisatory muddle of Indian patterns of settlement. The base had to have been designed and built by a government agency. The site had clearly been chosen and approved by hard-headed military men and state-appointed engineers. It was as if, in being adopted by the state, the bourgeois belief in the regularity of the world had been carried to the point of derangement. A special place ought to be reserved in hell, I thought to myself, for planners who build with such reckless disregard for their surroundings. Then one day, not long afterwards, while flying into New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, I looked out of the window and spotted Far Rockaway and Long Beach, the thickly populated Long Island neighborhoods that separate the airport from the Atlantic Ocean. Looking down from above, it was clear that those long rows of apartment blocks were sitting upon what had once been barrier islands, and that in the event of a major storm surge, they would be swamped, as indeed they were when Hurricane Sandy hit the area in 2012. Yet it was clear also that these neighborhoods had not sprung up haphazardly. The sanction of the state was evident in the ordered geometry of their streets. Only then did it strike me that the location of that base in the Nicobars was by no means anomalous. The builders had not in any sense departed from accepted global norms. To the contrary, they had merely followed the example of the European colonists who had founded cities like Bombay, Mumbai, Madras, New York, Singapore, and Hong Kong, all of which are situated directly on the ocean. Thinking about this, it occurred to me one day that pre-Enlightenment cities were not usually built on the water, on the edge of the water. The old ports of Europe, like London, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Stockholm, Lisbon, and Hamburg, are all protected from the open ocean by bays, estuaries, or deltaic river systems. The same is true of old Asian ports. Cochin, Surat, Tamluk, Miao, Guangzhou, Hangzhou, and Malacca are all cases to point. It is as if there was a general acceptance before the early modern era. The provision had to be made for the unpredictable furies of the ocean, tsunamis, storm surges, and the like. Mumbai's history provides a particularly telling example of the evolution of European attitudes in this regard. Today's Mumbai was originally a small archipelago of some half-dozen islands. Although settlements have existed on these islands for millennia, none of them was of significant size. The city that is now Mumbai began to take shape only after the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century. But the Portuguese, being pre-Enlightenment colonizers, chose to build their first major settlement on the mainland at Bassein. It was only when the island of Bombay passed into British hands that a city began to rise on the archipelago itself. By the end of the 19th century, the islands had become a peninsula jutting out from the mainland in such a fashion as to expose its entire western flank to the open ocean. Today, with cyclonic activity increasing rapidly in the Arabian Sea, the city of over 20 million inhabitants is dangerously exposed. The damage that could be inflicted on it by a superstorm like Sandy is too horrifying to contemplate. We can have that off. It's no accident that cities like Mumbai, New York, Boston, and Kolkata were all brought into being by the processes of early globalization. They were linked to each other not only through the circumstances of their founding, but also through certain patterns of trade in people and in commodities such as opium, cotton, whale oil, etc., that enabled the expansion and acceleration of Western economies. These cities were thus the drivers of the very processes that now threaten them with destruction. In that sense, their predicament is but an especially heightened instance of a plight that is now universal. It isn't only in retrospect that the siting of some of these cities now appear as acts of utter recklessness. Bombay's first Parsi residents were reluctant to leave older, more sheltered ports like Surat and Navsari and had to be offered financial incentives to move to the newly founded city. Similarly, Qing dynasty officials were astonished to learn that the British intended to build a city on the island of Hong Kong. Why would anyone want to create a settlement in a place that was so exposed to the vagaries of the earth? But in time, sure enough, there was a collective setting aside of the knowledge that accrues over generations through dwelling in a landscape, and people began to move closer and closer to the water. How did this come about? The same question arises also in relation to the coast around Fukushima in Japan, where stone tablets had been placed along the shoreline in the Middle Ages to serve as tsunami warnings. Future generations were explicitly told, do not build your homes below this point. The Japanese are certainly no more inattentive to the words of their ancestors than any other people. Yet not only did they build exactly where they had been warned not to, they actually situated a nuclear plant there. This too is an aspect of the uncanny as it pertains to the history of our relations with our various environments. It is not as if we had not been warned. It is not as if we were ignorant of the risks. An awareness of the precariousness of human existence is to be found in every culture. It is reflected in biblical and Quranic images of the apocalypse, in the figuring of the Fimbulwinter in Norse mythology, in tales of Pralay in Sanskrit literature, and so on. It was the literary imagination, most of all, that was everywhere informed by this awareness. Why then did these intuitions withdraw, not just from the minds of the founders of colonial cities, but also from the forefront of the literary imagination? And withdraw, indeed, they did, even from those poets and writers who were most acutely aware of their surroundings. For whatever nature may have been to Blake, Wordsworth, Thoreau, and Tagore, it was not, in the first instance, a source of fear or anxiety. Wonderment, awe, reverence, admiration, certainly, but not fear. How did this serene indifference to the destructive powers of the earth come about? How did a state of consciousness come into being such that millions of people would move to dangerously exposed locations? And the richer they are, the more exposed they are. The chronology of the founding of these cities is such as to create an almost irresistible temptation to point to the European Enlightenment, and more specifically to cite genealogies of thought going back to Descartes and Bacon that lead to a predatory hubris in relation to the earth and its resources. But this would tell us very little about the thinking of the men who built and planned that base in the Nicobars. If hubris and predation had anything to do with their choice of site, it was at a great remove. Between them and the cartographers and surveyors of an earlier era, there was, I think, a much more immediate link, a habit of mind that proceeded by creating discontinuities. That is to say, they were trained to break problems into smaller and smaller puzzles until a solution presented itself. Needless to say, this way of thinking deliberately excludes things and forces, externalities, that lie beyond the horizon of the matter at hand. If I have dwelt on this at some length, it's because the discontinuities that I have pointed to here have a bearing also on the ways in which worlds are created in novels. A setting is what allows most stories to unfold. Its relation to the action is as close as that of a stage to a play. When we read Middlemarch or Buddenbrooks or Waterland or the great Bengali novel, A River Called Titash Ekta Nodin Nam, we enter into their settings until they begin to seem real to us. We ourselves become emplaced within them. This exactly is why a sense of place is famously one of the great conjurations of the novel as a form. What the settings of fiction have in common with sites measured by surveyors is that they too are constructed out of discontinuities. Each setting being particular to itself, its connections to the world beyond are inevitably made to recede, as, for example, with the imperial networks that make possible the worlds portrayed by Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte. Unlike epics, novels do not usually bring multiple universes into conjunction, nor are their settings transportable outside their context in the manner of, say, Ithaca or Ayodhya. In fiction, the immediate discontinuities of place are nested within others. Maycomb, Alabama, the setting of To Kill a Mockingbird, becomes a stand-in for the whole of the Deep South. The Pequod, the small Nantucket whaling vessel in Moby Dick, becomes a metaphor for America. In this way, settings become the vessel for the exploration of that ultimate instance of discontinuity, the nation-state. In novels, discontinuities of space are accompanied also by discontinuities of time. A setting usually requires a period. It is actualized within a certain time horizon. Unlike epics, which often range over eons and epochs, novels rarely extend beyond a few generations. The longue durée is not the territory of the novel. It is through the imposition of these boundaries in time and space that the world of a novel is created. Like the margins of a page, these borders render places into texts so that they can be read. This process is beautifully illustrated in the opening pages of Titash Ekta Nodin Naam, a river called Titash, in the English translation. Published in 1956, this remarkable novel was the only work of fiction published by Adwaita Mollobormon, who belonged to an impoverished caste of Dalit fisherfolk. The novel is set in rural Bengal, in a village on the shores of a fictional river, Titash. Bengal, as I have said, is a land of titanic rivers. Mollobormon gestures towards the vastness of the landscape with these words. The bosom of Bengal is draped with rivers and their tributaries, twisted and intertwined like tangled locks, streaked with the white of foamy waves. But almost at once he begins to detach the setting of his novel from the larger landscape. All rivers are not the same, he tells us. Some are like, quote, a frenzied sculptor at work, destroying and creating restlessly in crazed joy, riding the high-flying swing of fearsome energy. Here is one kind of art. And then, in a striking declarative sentence, the writer announces his own intentions and premises. Quote, there is another kind of art. The picture this artist draws please the heart. Little villages dot the edges of the water. Behind these villages are stretches of farmland. In a land of immense waterways, Titash is thus a relatively small, gentle river. No cities or large towns ever grew up on its banks, writes Adwaita Mollobormon. Merchant boats with giant sails do not travel its waters. Its name is not in the pages of geography books, unquote. In this way, through a series of successive exclusions, Mollobormon creates a space that will submit to the techniques of a modern novel. Other villages, towns, and the great rivers of the land are pushed further and further into the background until at last we have a setting that can carry a novelistic narrative. Contrast this with the universes of boundless time and space that are conjured up by other forms of prose narrative. Here, for example, are a couple of passages from the beginning of the 16th century Chinese folk epic, The Journey to the West. Quote, at this point, the firmament first acquired its foundation. With another 5,400 years came the Zhou epoch. The ethereal and the light rose up to form the four phenomena of the sun, the moon, the stars, and the heavenly bodies. Following Panku's construction of the universe, the world was divided into four great continents. Beyond the ocean, there was a country named Aolai. It was near a great ocean, in the midst of which was located the famous Flower Fruit Mountain. Unquote. Here is a form of prose narrative, still immensely popular, that ranges widely and freely over vast expanses of time and space. It embraces the inconceivably large, almost to the same degree that the novel shuns it. Within the mansion of serious fiction, no one will speak of how continents were created, nor will they refer to the passage of thousands of years. Novels conjure up worlds that become real precisely because of their finitude and distinctiveness. But the earth of the Anthropocene, on the other hand, is a world of insistent, inescapable continuities, animated by forces that are nothing if not inconceivably vast. When my mother falls in Kolkata because of an unseasonable cold snap, it may turn out that this was due to the sagging of the circumpolar jet stream. The waters that are invading the Sundarbans are also swamping Miami Beach, and they are both linked through those rising waters to the melting glaciers of Greenland. There was never a time, of course, when the forces of weather and geology did not have a bearing on our lives. But nor has there ever been a time when they have pressed themselves on us with such relentless directness. We have entered, as Timothy Morton says, the age of hyper-objects, which are defined in part by their stickiness, their ever firmer adherence to our lives. Even to speak of the weather, that safest of subjects, is now to risk a quarrel with a denialist neighbor. No less than they mock the discontinuities and boundaries of the nation state, do these connections defy the boundedness of place, creating continuities of experience between Bengal and Louisiana, New York and Mumbai. The Anthropocene has reversed the temporal order of modernity. Those at the margins are now the first to experience the future that awaits all of us. Nor is it any longer possible to exclude this dynamic, even from places that were once renowned for their distinctiveness. Can anyone write about Venice anymore without mentioning the Acqua Alta, when the waters of the lagoon swamp the city's streets and courtyards? Nor can they ignore the relationship that this has with the fact that the second most commonly heard language in Venice is Bengali. For the men who run the quaint little vegetable stalls and bake the pizzas and even play the accordion are Bangladeshi, many of them displaced from Bengal by those very rising waters. And what of the tornado, no less unprecedented than the one I had experienced in Delhi, that recently struck the suburbs of Venice? Behind all of this lie those continuities and those inconceivably vast forces that have now become impossible to exclude, even from texts. Here, then, is another form of resistance, a scalar one, that the Anthropocene presents to the techniques that are most closely identified with the novel. Its essence consists of phenomena that were long ago expelled from the territory of serious fiction, forces of almost incomprehensible magnitude that create unbearably intimate connections over vast gaps in time and space. I'd like to return for a moment to the images I started with yesterday of apparently inanimate things coming suddenly alive. This, as I said earlier, is one of the uncanniest effects of the Anthropocene, this renewed awareness of the elements of agency and consciousness that humans share with many other beings, and even perhaps the planet itself. But such truth as this statement has is only partial. For the fact is that a great number of human beings had never lost this awareness in the first place. In the Sundarbans, for example, the people who live in and around the forest have never doubted that tigers and many other animals possess intelligence and agency. Nor is it the case that we were all equally captive to Cartesian dualism before the awareness of climate change dawned on us. My ancestors were certainly not in its thrall, and even I was never fully acculturated to that view of the world. Indeed, I would venture to say that this is true for most people in the world, even in the West. To the great majority of people everywhere, it has always been perfectly evident that dogs, for example, and horses, elephants, chimpanzees, and many other animals possess intelligence and emotions. Did anyone ever really believe, after Descartes, that animals are automatons? I suspect that even the most devoted Cartesians, including those who argue most vehemently against anthropomorphism, have no difficulty in distinguishing between an angry dog and a happy one. Nowhere is the awareness of non-human agency more evident than in traditions of narrative. In the Indian epics, and this is a tradition that remains vibrantly alive to this day, there is a completely matter-of-fact acceptance of the agency of non-human beings of many kinds. I refer not only to systems of belief, but also to techniques of storytelling. Non-humans provide much of the momentum of the epics. They provide the resolutions that allow the narrative to move forward. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, too, the intervention of gods, animals, and the elements are essential elements in the machinery of narration. This is true for many other narrative traditions as well, Asian, African, Mediterranean, and so on. The Old Testament is no exception. As the theologian Michael Northcott points out, at the heart of Judaism is a God who is encountered through nature and events, rather than words or texts. Christianity, by contrast, and then Islam, is a form of religion that is less implicated in the weather, climate, and political power, and more invested in words and texts. But within Christianity, too, it was not till the advent of Protestantism that man began to dream of achieving his own self-deification by radically isolating himself before an arbitrary God. But that dream of silencing the non-human has never been completely realized, not even within the very heart of contemporary modernity. Indeed, it would seem that one aspect of the agency of non-humans is that they have always found ways of staying abreast of technology. For even among today's teenagers and 20-somethings, whose most intimate familiars are man-made objects like iPads and iPhones, the suspicion, perhaps the hope, evidently still lingers that elements of agency lie hidden everywhere within our surroundings. Why else should the charts of best-selling books and top-grossing films continue to be so heavily weighted in favor of those that feature werewolves, vampires, witches, shapeshifters, extraterrestrials, mutants, and zombies? So the real mystery in relation to the agency of non-humans lies not in the renewed recognition of it, but rather in how this awareness came to be suppressed in the first place, at least within the modes of thought and expression that have become dominant over the last couple of centuries. Whatever the process, literary forms have clearly played an important, perhaps critical part in it. So if for a moment we were to take seriously the premise that I started with, that the Anthropocene has forced us to recognize that there are other, fully aware eyes looking over our shoulders, then the first question to suggest itself is this: what is the place of the non-human in the modern novel? To attempt to answer this is to confront another of the uncanny effects of the Anthropocene. This is that in exactly the period in which human activity was changing the Earth's atmosphere, literature was becoming ever more radically centered on the human. Inasmuch as the non-human was written about at all, it was not within the mansion of serious fiction, but rather in the outhouses to which science fiction and fantasy had been banished. To ask how this came about is to summon another question. What is it in the nature of modernity that could have led to this outcome? A possible answer is suggested by the work of Bruno Latour, who argues that one of the originary impulses of modernity is the project of partitioning, or deepening the imaginary gulf between nature and culture, one being relegated to the sciences, while the other becomes the exclusive domain of the human. Yet to look back at the evolution of literary culture from this vantage point is to recognize that the project of partitioning has always been contested, and never more so than at the inception, and nowhere more vigorously than in places that were in the vanguard of modernity. As proof of this, we have only to think of Wordsworth's sonnet, "The world is too much among us." Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Nor was it only in England, but throughout Europe and North America, that partitioning was resisted under the banners variously of romanticism, pastoralism, transcendentalism, and so on. Poets were always, perhaps, in the forefront of the resistance, in a line that extends from Hölderlin and Rilke to such present-day figures as Gary Snyder and W.S. Merwin. But being myself a writer of fiction, it is the novel that interests me most. And when we look at the evolution of this form, it becomes evident that its absorption into the project of partitioning was presaged already in the line of Wordsworth's that I quoted above. I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. It was with these words that the poet, even as he laments the onrushing intrusion of the age, announces his surrender to the most powerful of its tropes, that which envisages time as an irresistible, irreversible forward movement. This jealous deity, the time god of modernity, has it in his power to decide who will be cast into the shadows of backwardness, the dark tunnel of time outworn, and who will be granted the benediction of being ahead of the rest, always en avant. It is this conception of time that allows the work of partitioning to proceed within the novel, always aligning itself with the avant-garde as it hurtles forward in its impatience to erase every archaic reminder of man's kinship with the non-human. The history of this partitioning is, of course, an epic in itself, offering subplots and characters to suit the tastes of every reader. Here, I'd like to dwell for a moment on a plot that completely reverses itself between the 18th century and today, the story of the literary tradition's curious relationship with science. At the birth of modernity, the relationship between literature and science was very close and was perhaps perfectly exemplified in the figure of the writer Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, who wrote one of the earliest of bestsellers, Paul et Virginie. Goethe also famously saw no conflict between his literary and scientific interests, conducting experiments in optics and propounding theories that remain compelling to this day, the vitalism to which Dipesh refers in one of his most recent articles. Herman Melville, too, was deeply interested in the study of marine animals, and his views on the subject are, of course, expounded at length in Moby Dick. I could cite many other instances, ranging from the mathematics of War and Peace to the chemistry of Alice in Wonderland, but there is no need. It is hardly a matter of dispute that Western writers remained deeply engaged with science through the 19th century. Nor was this a one-sided engagement. Naturalists and scientists not only read, but also produced some of the most significant literary works of the 19th century, ranging from Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle to Alfred Russel Wallace's The Malay Archipelago. Their works, in turn, served as an inspiration to a great number of poets and writers, including Tennyson. But as Latour has shown, the project of partitioning is supported always by a related enterprise, one that he describes as purification, the purpose of which is to ensure that nature remains off limits to culture, the knowledge of which is consigned entirely to the sciences. This entails the marking off and suppression of hybrids, and that, of course, is exactly the story of the birth of science fiction, as a genre separate from the literary mainstream. The line that has been drawn between them exists only for the sake of neatness, because the zeitgeist of late modernity could not tolerate nature-culture hybrids. The existence of this line has, of course, been a grievance with many who were thus relegated to the status of genre writers, and rightly so, for nothing could be more puzzling than the strange conceit that science fiction deals with material that is somehow contaminated. Nothing could better express the completeness of the literary mainstream's capitulation to the project of partitioning. And this capitulation has come at a price, for it is literary fiction itself that has been diminished by it. If a list were to be made of the late 20th century novelists whose works remain influential today, we would find, I suspect, that many who once bestrode the literary world like colossi are entirely forgotten, while writers like Arthur C. Clarke, Raymond Bradbury, and Philip K. Dick are near the top of that list. That said, the question remains, is it the case that science fiction is better equipped to address the Anthropocene than mainstream literary fiction? This might appear obvious to many. After all, there is now a new genre of science fiction called climate fiction, or cli-fi. But cli-fi is made up mostly of disaster stories set in the future, and that, to me, is exactly the rub. The future is but one aspect of the Anthropocene. It comprises also the recent past and, most significantly, the present. In a perceptive essay on science fiction and speculative fiction, Margaret Atwood writes that they, quote, all draw from the same deep well, those imagined other worlds located somewhere apart from our everyday one. In another time, in another dimension, through a doorway into the spirit world, or on the other side of the threshold that divides the known from the unknown. Science fiction, speculative fiction, sword and sorcery fantasy, and slipstream fiction, all of them might be placed under the same large wonder tale umbrella, unquote. This lays out with marvelous clarity some of the ways in which the Anthropocene resists science fiction. It is precisely not an imagined other world distant from ours, nor is it located in another time or dimension. By no means are the events of the era of global warming akin to the stuff of wonder tales. Yet it is also true that they are in many ways uncanny in relation to what we think of as normal. And they have indeed opened a doorway into what we might call a spirit world. That is, the voices of the non-human. Global warming's resistance to the arts begins deep underground, in the recesses where organic matter undergoes the transformations that makes it possible for us to devour the sun's energy in fossilized forms. Think of the vocabulary that is associated with these substances: naphtha, bitumen, petroleum, tar, and fossil fuels. No poet or singer could make these syllables fall lightly on the ear. Many painters have portrayed olive trees and olive oil. None, so far as I know, have painted kerosene. And think of the substances themselves: coal and the sooty residue it leaves on everything it touches, and oil, viscous, foul-smelling, repellent to all the senses. Of coal, at least it can be said that the manner of its extraction is capable of sustaining stories of class solidarity, courage, and resistance, as in Zola's Germinal, for instance, and John Sayles' fine film, Matewan. Indeed, as Tim Mitchell has pointed out, the very methods by which coal was mined tended to foster resistance. But oil, its sources are mainly hidden from sight, veiled by technology, and its workers are hard to mythologize, being largely invisible. As for the places where oil is extracted, they possess nothing of the raw visual power that is manifest, for example, in the mining photographs of Sebastião Salgado. Oil refineries are usually so heavily fortified that little can be seen of them other than a distant gleam of metal with tanks, pipelines, derricks glowing under jets of flame. One such fortress figures in my first novel, The Circle of Reason, which published in 1986, a part of which is about the discovery of oil in a fictional emirate called Al Ghazira. Quote, out of the sand there suddenly arose the barbed wire fence of the oil town. From the other side of the fence, faces stared silently out. Filipino faces, Indian faces, Egyptian faces, Pakistani faces, even a few Ghaziri faces, a whole world of faces, unquote. Behind these eerie, dislocated enclaves of fenced-in faces and towering derricks lies a history that impinges on the lives of everyone on this planet. This is true especially in regard to the Arabian Peninsula, where oil brought about an encounter with the West that has had consequences that touch upon every aspect of our existence, extending from matters of security to the buildings that surround us and the quality of the air we breathe. Yet the strange reality is that the oil encounter, whose tremors and aftershocks we feel every day, has almost no presence in our imaginative lives, in art, music, dance, or literature. Long after the publication of The Circle of Reason, I wrote a piece in which I attempted to account for this mysterious absence. The piece was actually a review of one of the few works of fiction to address the oil encounter, a 5-part series of novels by the Jordanian-born writer Abderrahman Munif. My review, which was called Petrofiction, dealt only with the first 2 books in the cycle, which were published in English translation as Cities of Salt, Mudun al-Malh, and The Trench, Al-Ukhdud. The truth is, I wrote in my review, that we do not yet possess the form that can give the oil encounter a literary expression. For this reason alone, Cities of Salt ought to be regarded as a work of immense significance. It so happens that the first novel in the cycle is also, in many ways, a wonderful work of fiction, perhaps even in parts a great one. This was written in 1992. I was not aware then that Cities of Salt had been reviewed 4 years earlier by one of the most influential figures in the American literary firmament, John Updike. His review, when I read it, made a great impression on me. I found that in the process of writing about Munif's book, Updike had also articulated, elegantly and authoritatively, a conception of the novel that was, in fact, an accurate summing up of a great deal of contemporary fiction. Yet it was a conception with which I found myself completely at odds. The differences between Updike's views and mine have an important bearing on some of the aspects of the Anthropocene that I have been addressing here, so it's best to let him speak for himself. Here is what he had to say about Cities of Salt. Quote, "It is unfortunate, given the epic potential of his topic, that Mr. Munif appears to be insufficiently westernized to produce a narrative that feels much like what we call a novel. There is almost none of that sense of individual moral adventure, of the evolving individual in varied and roughly equal battle with a world of circumstance, which, since Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe, has distinguished the novel from the fable and the chronicle. Cities of Salt is concerned instead with men in the aggregate," unquote. This passage is remarkable in the first instance because the conception of the novel that is articulated here is rarely put into words, even though it has come to exercise great sway across the world, and especially in the Anglosphere. My own disagreement with it hinges upon the phrase that Updike uses to distinguish the novel from the fable and the chronicle, individual moral adventure. But why, I find myself asking, should the defining adventures of the novel be described as moral, as opposed to, say, intellectual or political or spiritual? In what sense could it be said that War and Peace or Moby Dick are about individual moral adventures? It's certainly true that some of the narrative threads in these novels could be described in this way, but those would account for only a small part of the whole. I ask these questions not in order to pass small semantic differences. I believe that Updike had actually put his finger on a very important aspect of contemporary culture. I will return to this later in the fourth lecture. But for now, I'd like to turn to another aspect of Updike's mapping of the territory of the novel, that which is excluded from it. Updike draws this boundary line with great clarity. The reason why Cities of Salt does not feel much like a novel, he tells us, is that it is concerned not with a sense of individual moral adventures, but rather with men in the aggregate. In other words, what is banished from the territory of the novel is precisely the collective. But is it actually the case that novelists have shunned men or women in the aggregate? And inasmuch as they have, is it a matter of intention or narrative expediency? In a perceptive discussion of Updike's review, the critic Rob Nixon points out that Munif is, quote, scarcely alone in working with a crowded canvas and with themes of collective transformation, unquote. Emile Zola, Upton Sinclair, and many others have also treated individual character as secondary to collective metamorphosis. Indeed, so numerous are the traces of the collective within the novelistic tradition that anyone who chose to look for them would soon be overwhelmed. Such being the case, should Updike's view be summarily dismissed? My answer is no, because Updike was, in a certain sense, right. It is a fact that the contemporary novel has indeed become ever more radically centered on the individual psyche, while the collective, men in the aggregate, has receded, both in the cultural and the fictional imagination. Where I differ from Updike is that I do not think that this turn in contemporary fiction has anything to do with the novel as a form. It is a matter of record that historically many novelists, from Tolstoy and Dickens to Steinbeck and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, have written very effectively about men in the aggregate. In many parts of the world, they continue to do so. Munif's work is but an instance of this. What Updike captures, then, is not by any means an essential element of the novel as a form. His characterization is true, rather, of a turn that fiction took in certain places at a certain time. Seen from the perspective of the Anthropocene, it is no coincidence, I think, that these places were exactly those that were then leading the way to the great acceleration of the late 20th century. I say it is no coincidence for two reasons. The first is that the acceleration in carbon emissions and the turn away from the collective are both effects of that aspect of modernity that sees time, in Bruno Latour's words, as an irreversible arrow, as capitalization, as progress. I've noted before that this idea of a continuous and irreversible forward movement, led by an avant-garde, has been one of the animating forces of the literary and artistic imagination since the start of the 20th century. A progression of this sort inevitably creates winners and losers, and in the case of 20th century fiction, one of the losers was exactly writing of the kind in which the collective had a powerful presence. Fiction of this kind was usually of a realist variety, and it receded because it was consigned to the netherworld of backwardness. But the era of global warming has made audible a new, non-human critical voice that forces us to ask whether those old realists were so used up after all. That's a phrase used by John Barthes. Consider the example of John Steinbeck, never a favorite of the avant-garde, and once famously dismissed by Lionel Trilling as a writer who thought like a social function, not a novelist. Yet, if we look back upon Steinbeck now, in full awareness of what is now known about the future of the planet, his work seems far from superseded, quite the contrary. What we see, rather, is a visionary placement of the human within the non-human. We see a form, an approach that grapples with climate change avant la lettre. Around the world, too, there are many writers, not all of them realists, from whose work neither the aggregate nor the non-human have ever been absent. To cite only a few examples from India, in Bengalis there is the work of Advaita Mollobormon and Mahashweta Devi, in Kannada Shivarama Karanth, in Uriya Gopinath Mohanty, in Marathi Vishwas Patil. Of these writers, too, I suspect that Updike would have said that their books were not much like what we consider novels. Indeed, Salman Rushdie once dismissed all writing in Indian languages as lagging behind advanced writing in English. But once again, the last laugh goes to that sly critic, the Anthropocene, which has muddied and perhaps even reversed our understanding of what it means to be advanced. Were we to adopt the arrow-like time perspective of the moderns, we might even say of writers like Munif and Mahashweta Devi that they were actually ahead of their peers elsewhere. Here, then, is another reason why something more than mere chance appears to be at play in the turn that fiction took as emissions were rising in the late 20th century. It is one of the many turns of the period that give, in retrospect, the uncanny impression that Earth is toying with humanity. Thus, for example, we are presented with the mirage of a hiatus at just the time when there is a rise in concern about global warming. Similarly, at exactly the time when it has become clear that global warming is in every sense a collective predicament, humanity finds itself in the thrall of a dominant culture in which the idea of the collective has been exiled from politics, economics, and literature alike. Inasmuch as contemporary fiction is caught in this thraldom, this is one of the most powerful ways in which global warming resists it. It is as if the gas had run out on a generation accustomed to jet skis, leaving them with the task of reinventing sails and oars. Miao-U is the site of a vast and enchanting complex of Buddhist pagodas and monasteries in western Burma. Once the capital of the Arakan, Rakhine Kingdom, it flourished between the 14th and 17th centuries. To get to Miao-U isn't easy. The nearest town of any size is Sitwe, formerly Akiab, and from there the journey to the site can take a day or more, depending on the conditions of the road. As Miao-U approaches, ranges of low hills of rounded, dome-like shapes appear in the distance. At times, the ridges seem to rise into spires and finials. Such is the effect that the experience of entering the site is like stepping into a zone where the human and non-human echo each other with an uncanny resonance. The connection between built form and landscape seems to belong to a dimension other than the visual. It is like that of sympathetic chords in music. The echoes reach into the interiors of the monuments, which, with their openings and pathways, the intricate dappling of light and shadow, and the endless iterations of images, seem to aspire to be forests of stone. In How Forests Think, the anthropologist Eduardo Kohn suggests that forms, by which he means much more than shapes or visual metaphors, are one of the means that enable our surroundings to think through us. But how, we might ask, can any question of thought arise in the absence of language? Cohn's answer is that to imagine these possibilities, we need to move beyond language. But to what? Merely to ask that question is to become aware of the multiple ways in which we are constantly engaged in patterns of communication that are not linguistic. As, for example, when we try to interpret the nuances of a dog's bark, or when we listen to patterns of bird calls, or when we try to figure out what exactly is portended by a sudden change in the sound of the wind as it blows through the trees. None of this is any less demanding or any less informative than, say, listening to the news on the radio. We do these things all the time. We could not stop doing them if we tried. Yet we don't think of them as communicative acts requiring interpretation. Why? Is it perhaps because the shadow of language interposes itself, preventing us from doing so? It isn't only the testimony of our ears that is blocked in this way, but also that of our eyes. For we often communicate with animals by means of gestures that require interpretation. As, for example, when I wave my hands to shoo away a crow. To think like a forest, then, is, as Kohn says, to think in images. And the astonishing profusion of images in Miao-U, most of which are of the Buddha in the Bhumi Sparsha Mudra, with the tip of the middle finger of his right hand resting on the earth, serve precisely to direct the viewer away from language, towards all that cannot be thought through words. These possibilities have, of course, been explored by people in many cultures and in many eras. In fact, everywhere, perhaps except within the modern academy. What then is to be made of the fact that the possibilities have now succeeded also in broaching the boundaries of the one sphere from which they were excluded? Could it be said, extending Cohn's argument, that this synchronicity confirms that the Anthropocene has become our interlocutor, that it is indeed thinking through us? Would it follow then, on the analogy of Cohn's suggestion in relation to forests, that to think about the Anthropocene will be to think in images, that it will require a departure from our accustomed logocentrism. Could that be the reason why television and film have found it much easier to address climate change than has literary fiction? And if that is so, then what will it imply for the future of the novel? It is possible, of course, to construct many different genealogies for the deepening logocentrism of the last several centuries. But the one point where all those lines of descent converge is the invention of print technology, which moved the logocentrism and iconophobia of the Abrahamic religions in general, and the Protestant Reformation in particular, onto a new plane. Merely to trace the evolution of the printed book is to observe the slow but inexorable excision of all the pictorial elements that had previously existed within texts: illuminated borders, portraits, coloring, line drawings, and so on. This pattern is epitomized by the career of the novel, which in the 18th and 19th centuries often included frontispieces, plates, and so on. But all of these elements gradually faded away over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, until the very word illustration became a pejorative, not just within fiction, but in all the arts. It was as if every doorway and window that might allow us to escape the confines of language had to be slammed shut to make sure that humans had no company in their dwindling world but their own abstractions. This indeed is a horizon within which every advance, as Franco Moretti says, is achieved at the cost of making the world more unlivable. But then came a sea change. With the internet, we were suddenly back in a time when text and image could be twinned with as much facility as in an illuminated manuscript. It is surely no coincidence that images began to seep back into the textual world of the novel, as in the work of W.G. Sebald. Then came the graphic novel, and it soon began to be taken seriously. So, if it is the case that the last, but perhaps most intransigent way that the Anthropocene resists literary fiction lies ultimately in its resistance to language, then it would seem to follow that new hybrid forms will emerge, and the act of reading itself will change once again, as it has many times before. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Ghosh, we have 2 microphones as we did last
Yes.
night, so if you just want to start on this side, and then maybe we'll go back and forth.
Sure. There's a question up here.
Thank you.
Thank
Dr. Ghosh, you began by saying that you were out of your element at the podium, but many of us in the audience have learned from your lectures that the novelist mind is adept at organizing worldly observation into knowledge that can come across in persuasive expository prose. Can you offer any advice to academics in the audience as someone who pursued a DPhil as to how we can think more like a novelist, aside from just by reading more novels?
That's a very interesting question. Really, it's a very interesting question. I don't know what I can say. You know, many years ago, during one of my brief stints in teaching, I happened to be associated with a department where graduate students in the social sciences, one of the social sciences, were being encouraged to write like novelists. And I have to say that I thought this created, this had a terrible effect on the graduate students. I mean, you know, because they suddenly had felt that, you know, they had to be writing like experimental writers. And the trouble is that, you know, in a university department, what you're engaged in is pedagogy. And there is no pedagogy for writing novels. You know, frankly, I believe that although we have tried to invent pedagogies, I don't think that they actually work, you know, often. So, you know, I think it's, in a way, if you impose that burden upon students, you know, without creating a pedagogy to go with it, I think it can be incredibly destructive. I mean, I saw many students literally self-destruct under the pressure of trying to write like novelists, you know. I mean, it's much more useful that they should put what they know out there into the world, you know?
We have a question on this side.
Yes.
So there was a point where you were saying that after the 18th century, writers didn't feel enough fear of nature. And I was wondering then, where would you put the aesthetic category of the sublime in the 18th and 19th century? And I was also thinking of novels like, say, Frankenstein or Vathek or Wuthering Heights, and the development of genres like Gothic, horror, sensational fiction in the 19th century. And so it's almost as if, you know, the really horrifying aspects of the natural world and the sublime did not have as exalted a place in fiction as it did in philosophy or poetry.
That's a very, very good question. In fact, I did try to see. What happens is that the sublime does, exactly as you suggest, become shunted off outside serious fiction. You know, what we get is that we have this category of serious fiction, and outside that we have, let's say, Frankenstein. And you know, it's a very strange and curious thing which had not occurred to me, that actually the entire category of, you know, the Gothic, the horror, science fiction, arose out of a strange climatic event. You know, Byron went off to Switzerland. He had to get away from England, and in that month, he was caught in this terrible weather. And he invited all his friends to write stories write really frightening stories about what frightened them. And that was when, Mary Shelley started thinking about Frankenstein. So it is very interesting that actually, and in Byron's own work, he often sort of flirts with the Gothic, the sublime, and so on. But that's just it. I mean, it's exactly in this period that we see this partitioning, this partitioning of nature-culture hybrids, which ultimately gives us, these forms like science fiction and so on, as I describe here. Thank you.
There's a question on the,
yes.
Just up this side.
Yes.
To move for the shift to focus for a moment from the agency of the non-human to the non-agency of the human, what do you see as the particular relationship between the novel and subjectivity, given that, as been said for death, it reduces the subject back to an object. When we have these cataclysmic climate events, they reduce us to a point where we no longer have the dignity of a subject. Is there something particular to the novel, its take on subjectivity, that makes it difficult for it to deal with this type of phenomena?
Very good question. Yes, absolutely. I think it's very hard. If your conception of the novel is one in which subjectivity, individual subjectivity is absolutely at the core, then it does become very hard to deal with, to deal with events of this kind. But again, as I'm arguing here, I don't think it is necessarily the case. It's something that's emerged over time, if you like. I mean, that the novel has become this thing, which has retreated into the bedroom, into consciousness, That was certainly not the novel of Melville, It was certainly not the way that Tolstoy thought of the novel. But again, there's begging the question, because Tolstoy himself didn't conceive of himself as writing a novel. He thought he was writing history. And so in a way, I think, this idea of the novel's enfolded form, if you like, is something which actually reaches us in late modernity. I don't really feel that that it's necessary to the novel. And I certainly feel that it's also possible to, to think about writing in different ways, decentering subjectivity, And it's curious, I've just received a manuscript from a very young Indian writer, which seems to me to be doing exactly these things. Thank you.
I had one question over here, and then we'll get those in the middle.
Thanks. Picking up on your last point about
the changing nature of reading. I would be curious to hear you reflect on the reader's role and the reader's perspective in the phenomenon you're discussing. At the end of yesterday's lecture, you mentioned one thing that would discourage you from writing in a certain way would be the New York Times Book Review not being receptive to it. Presumably, the New York Times Book Review is driven to some extent by what the readers of the New York Times Book Review, what their appetite is. So I'd be interested if you'd help us think through the reader's role in creating the landscape, or maybe the absence of one, in terms of thinking through these issues seriously in serious writing.
That's very interesting. I was joking yesterday. I mean, the New York Times Book Review has not reviewed many of my books, and I'm still here. So, but I was just trying to make the point that I was referring to the citadel of serious fiction, if you like. But yes, I think reading is completely changing. It's absolutely changing. Often when I was writing my trilogy, these last 3 books, it really struck me that I was doing something that is completely at odds with the world. I spent 10 years working on this 1,600-page project. Thinking about very little else, keeping my mind completely focused in a world which is increasingly attention distracted. But we can already see the ways in which readerships are changing. I mean, if you go to, especially in America, if you go to book events, especially like literary festivals, you see immediately that the people who come there are mainly they're mainly 50 and over, and the gender ratio is also incredibly skewed. I mean, it's many more women read than men. But there again, you see that there's a very particular demographic to reading. It's very rare in America, that I do a reading or the one goes to a reading and sees the young men, young women even, who are, let's say, in their between 20 and 30. So I think it's clear that younger people are reading in different ways. They're interacting with texts in different ways, and this doesn't scare me. I mean, I think actually, I really feel that why is it that serious fiction is so logocentric? I mean, if you look at 19th century novels, if you look at early editions, it's very interesting just to do this. Look at early editions of, say, Pride and Prejudice or whatever. Until about 1860, 1870, there are many sort of plates, illustrations. Then they begin to fade out, Then there are fewer and fewer. There might be one frontispiece or something. But by the 20th century, and especially with the arrival of the paperback, all iconic matter disappears completely from the text. And it really, I mean, I remember as a child, I was living in the 60s as a child. If your parents caught you reading a comic book, they would get incredibly upset because they thought it would make you silly, that it would prevent your mind from thinking. So great was the faith in this abstract logocentrism. And to me, I sometimes blog. I enjoy blogging, and I love it. This is exactly why, because you can twin, you can use image and text in this way. And I certainly feel that especially I felt it when I was visiting this place Miao U. There are ways in which landscapes reflect themselves in the human. In which landscapes speak. Literally to the human and mold the human, if you like. And the Anthropocene, I think, has certainly brought us to a moment when we recognize, that the non-human is so urgently, crowding in on us. And how will we respond to this in the arts? I don't think abstract expressionism is going to do it. We have to find some other way.
We have time for one last question, so be here in the middle.
I love the way you weave together different ideas and concepts. One I'm having a little trouble with is modernity. And while there may be no succinct definition, could you spend just a moment on what you mean by modernity?
Oh my God. I'm always looking for a succinct definition so I can put it in the book. Bruno Latour has a good definition where he describes it as, this whole complex of ideas that arises, going back to the Enlightenment, and then which gradually gathers force with the Industrial Revolution, and ultimately becomes the foundation of a certain sort of industrial society, if you like. That's a terrible definition. I'm sure there are 100 people here who could do better than me. But thank you anyway. There was one last question up here, so.
Thank you very much. It's a double one. First of all, in which language do you write your fiction? And reading the brochure, I see that our friendly hosts have a particular interest in the academic study of great works of Western literature. How Western are you?
In some ways I'm very Western, I think, but in some ways I'm not at all Western. But then you have to ask yourself, what is Western, But yeah, I think in my essential instincts and intuitions, I'm not very Western. But what language do I write in? I write in English. But I read many other languages, and most of all, I read a lot in Bengali. So my mind, one of the ways in which I'm not Western is that my mind is what they call heteroglossic. Every bit of my consciousness exists in a different language. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.